Thank you.
All right, well, here in Canberra today, we've heard from the head of Huawei, the Australian chairman of the Chinese telco, defending the operations of the company, denying that it's secretly gathering intelligence for China and insisting that it should be allowed to take part in the rollout of the new 5G wireless network in Australia. The decision on that is pending. It's expected in the next few weeks at the latest as to whether it will be allowed. Huawei was not allowed to be involved in the rollout of the NBN. We know that the intelligence community has expressed some concern about this to other countries in the Pacific as well, the Solomon Islands in particular, with Australian aid dollars now to fund the undersea internet cable to that country. But here was John Lord, as I say, the chairman of Huawei in Australia, arguing that when it comes to their products and their involvement in the 5G wireless network, Australians should not be worried at all.
So we in Huawei will say to all the countries we're in, the products we deliver to your country will be clean and they'll be the best that we can provide. Now, we will provide that as a certainty and a guarantee. So that's what we will guarantee.
He spoke about the rise of smart China, as he put it, something that we're all going to have to get used to. More companies like Huawei that are starting to dominate the global scene when it comes to technology in particular. He said no accusation of, after inspections, audits, reviews in many countries, 170 countries they operate in, has ever proved anything sinister on behalf of Huawei. And what about this Chinese law that's often pointed to that requires Chinese companies to assist Chinese intelligence agencies? Here's what he said about that.
Myth 3. Under Chinese national law, or national intelligence law, Huawei has to cooperate and collaborate in intelligence work. The law actually contains some safeguards that discharge individuals and organisations from providing support that would contradict their legitimate rights and interests. And that law has no legitimacy outside of China. We obey the laws in every country in which we operate in, over 170. In Australia, we follow Australian laws. To do otherwise in any one country would be corporate suicide.
With me now is Labor MP Michael Danby, who has been raising concerns about Huawei. Thanks for your time. Thanks. You watched that speech in the Q&A at the press club there from the chairman, John Lord. He says in Australia they have to follow Australian law. Is that good enough?
No, it's not. I think the original allegations made in The Economist some years ago that Huawei is the company that spooked the world were confirmed by John Lord's appearance today.
How so?
Well, he said that two crucial things. One, that the companies have to report to a Communist Party cell, and he said that was law in China and done in all companies. He made the extraordinary claim that BHP has a Communist Party cell in China at the top of it too.
Well, I don't know he said the company has to report to it. He said there is a Communist cell within the company, as there is within any company that has to operate in China, and he kind of likened it to a social club.
Pull the other one. David, the intelligence law that you mentioned means that the people who are in the company who would have to report on those kind of things. And of course, the real fear is that in the technology there'd be a backdoor to Australia's secret communications and to our communications network. That's why the government, on advice from security services, didn't allow the NBN to go ahead, and that's why I'm confident that with non-partisan support they'll do the same with 5G.
Well, let's just break that down, because, I mean, listening to him today, he says, our operation in Australia would be squeaky clean. The equipment that's used here can be verified by independent experts to ensure it's not, bugged or anything like that. That Communist Party cell is in their Chinese operation. He was kind of suggesting two different things.
But David, he said that effectively that the ownership is only owned by Chinese citizens,
yes,
and that ghost shares were issued to people outside. So it's the Chinese citizens who are subject to Chinese law who effectively run the company. And would any Chinese citizen in the current circumstances, defy a visit from the Chinese security services saying you've got to tell me this or use this bit of technology that we've got there to report on this development? I'm not criticising Huawei differently from other Beijing companies. They all have the same problem. Basically, we're dealing with an authoritarian state.
But what about his point that, like Nokia, for example, that has a factory in China where it makes its widgets as well? What's the difference?
Well, the difference is that Nokia outside of China would be very reticent to insert technology in it that people from Huawei in China wouldn't be concerned about inserting, because they would be subject to Chinese law. They're Chinese citizens and subject to this Chinese intelligence legislation. You know, I feel sorry for Huawei and its employees in Australia in the sense that they're operating under the dictum of a country that has that system throughout all of its companies, whether they're owned by groups of Chinese citizens or by state-owned enterprises. So they're in an impossible position, and I think John Lord's appearance before the press club, and with all of you guys from the press asking him these difficult questions, it just showed how hard it was to represent a company like that, and why would we not, as Australian leaders on the government or opposition, not take the advice of the security services?
So essentially what you're saying is that no Chinese company, whether it is linked to the Chinese government or not, no Chinese company can ever be involved in any critical infrastructure in Australia?
Yes.
That's a pretty big call.
It's a pretty big call. By the way, that does not obviate the ability of China to invest in Australia. We've had $200 billion of Chinese direct investment in Australia, according to the Foreign Investment Review Board, in the last 5 years. So, you know, when Bob Carr and John Brumby and their allies sort of start whinging a bit about being unfair to China, you know, as Kevin Rudd used to say, fair shake of the sauce bottle. That we welcome Chinese investment. We should be colourblind as to where it comes from. But where critical infrastructure is involved, we should represent our national interests. And if it's 5G or it's the poles and wires in New South Wales, we should put that as a primary interest.
Would you say that for any foreign government-linked company or just China?
Well, I think we're part of the democratic world. We're part of the Five Eyes system, and I think that you know, investment by Britain or the United States or Canada and Australia, we naturally view more benignly.
And so, what's the difference with China?
Well, China has antagonistic state interests sometimes to Australia. We try and minimise them. We want to have good relations with them, but we don't support the militarisation against the international community's International Court of Appeal in the South China Sea.
In the South China Sea, but does China have antagonistic intentions towards Australia?
Look, I'll leave that to the security services and the defence people in the future. Look, I don't support them building docks in Vanuatu that have dual purposes. I don't support them laying cables from the Solomons that would link up with Australian telecommunications. There are differences. We have to be clear about it. We're a proud, rich and strong country, and we have to stand up when our interests are involved and say no on certain occasions, at the same time as having good relations with them as possible. For instance, I support what Paul Keating says, that we should be involved in that Asian Development Bank. There's nothing wrong with that, even though it's got Chinese leadership, because it involves capital, it involves investment in Australia, or a capital-poor country. That's a separate issue from whether we give them access to our telecommunications via 5G or NBN, or whether we give them access to Ausgrid.
Michael Danby, we have to leave it there, but it is a fascinating area. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. We're going to take a quick break.